Welcome to Lesson 10. In this lesson, we will briefly discuss nutrient cycles primarily in relation to successional change. We will discuss the relationship to disturbance later in the course. Nutrients can largely be classified into two main groups, which defines their source and cycling characteristics. First, we have the sedimentary nutrients. All those are derived from on-site or off-site rock parent material, so they come from rock. We have phosphorus, potassium, sodium, calcium, magnesium, manganese, boron, iron, copper, zinc, and sulfur. And then the other group is the gaseous group, those for which the primary source is the atmosphere, and those include nitrogen, carbon, and also sulfur. So note that sulfur is found in both groups. It occurs as a constituent of parent material, of the rock, but also in the gas sulfur dioxide. Nutrients on a given site are derived from several processes. First, we have weathering of primary minerals. On sites with young to medium-aged rocks, the rocks are the source of 85 to 100% of all the primary nutrients except for nitrogen. On older, highly weathered sites, the percentage declines and may actually approach zero, such in Amazonia and Central Australia with very old parent material and weathered rock. These input rates are related to three main things. We have the rock age, particle size, mineralogy, and composition. So characteristics that relate to the rock itself. Then we have the environment, precipitation and temperature and other climate variables, and also topography. And then the third one is biological activity, so microbes, other organisms. As an example, we can look at the nutrient phosphorus in the ecosystem as a function of succession. We have phosphorus of tied in different ways. We have that's contained in minerals. We have phosphorus that's incorporated in organic material. We have phosphorus that is occulted, or that is kind of included in the ions of iron and aluminum oxides and largely unavailable to plants. And then also phosphorus that is more absorbed on top of the surface of iron and aluminum oxide and is available to plants. But as a total, the phosphorus through time decreases along a successional gradient. Another source of nutrient is atmospheric deposition, and that can come through precipitation, and significant sources of nitrogen come this way. Deposition can happen via water vapor and associated gases with fog, and they may result in significant inputs of sulfur dioxide or nitrogen in various forms, nitrite, nitrate, and ammonium. And especially in coastal areas where we have a lot of fog. Pollutants, of course, can also be deposited via precipitation. And then we also have dry deposition via dust or gaseous deposition of, for example, calcium, potassium, and magnesium. It's difficult to measure the amount of this, but the dry deposition may account for as much as 30 to 50% of new nutrients in some areas. And a third way that nutrients are derived are via biological conversion, and this applies to nitrogen especially. Atmospheric nitrogen is not available to plant, but the forms of nitrate and ammonia are forms that are available for plants. Nitrite or NO2 is not available to plants. We'll talk more about the nitrogen cycle here in a bit. Nitrogen cycles through the ecosystem via a number of processes and chemical reactions. So let's start at the top of this diagram where we have the atmospheric nitrogen. That's just part of the air. That nitrogen is fixed into organic material through activities by organisms that's called diazotropes. These diazotropes are bacteria or archaea that fix atmospheric nitrogen gas. Some examples are rhizobia and Frankia. Nitrogen incorporated into organic biomass can be available to vascular plants directly in two forms. At the bottom of the diagram we see ammonia, which is the reduced form, NH4, and the oxidized form is nitrate, NO3. Nitrate can also be denitrified and go back to atmospheric nitrogen, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. This diagram is from the Barber book and illustrates the various forms of nitrogen in the nitrogen cycle and the types of organisms that are involved with some of the changes. So if you look to the far right, again we have the molecular nitrogen N2, which is part of the air, and again the nitrogen fixation can occur via these diazotropes that I talked about on the last slide. And some of examples are Rhizobium, Frankia, Azotobacter, blue-green cyanobacteria, which you probably heard about or maybe remember from the last lecture about the biological crusts. Anyway, so these organisms, the diazotropes, take the nitrogen in the air to ammonia, which is the reduced form of nitrogen that's available to plants, and then that can be oxidized by other organisms, Nitrosomonas and Nitrosococcus, and further into nitrate by Nitrobacter and Nitrosococcus. So just a little bit of summary here on the nitrogen cycle. Ammonia is changed to nitrite by Nitrosomonas and Nitrosococcus. Nitrite is changed to nitrate by Nitrobacter bacteria. And since this process requires oxygen, so converting this ammonia, the reduced form, to an oxidized form, it is sensitive to soil aeration, soil moisture, pH, and other environmental conditions. And again, organisms capable of fixing atmospheric nitrogen are referred to as diazotropes. And of course, they are incredibly important for all life on Earth. A non-biological way of fixing nitrogen is via lightning. Lightning can break down the bonds between nitrogen atoms in the air, causing them to react with oxygen and forming nitrogen dioxide gas. This nitrogen dioxide gas then can dissolve in water and produce nitric and nitrous acid. And if the acids lose their hydrogen atom or their hydrogen, they form nitrate and nitrite ions. And I'm sure you remember that nitrate can be utilized by plants. So let's spend a little bit of time on these organisms called diazotropes. Diazotropes can be divided into three groups based on their ecology. First, we have the symbiotic diazotropes. They live in the symbiotic relationship with another organism that provides them with energy, nutrients, water, and protection. They may occur in the root system of some plants, certain species of lichens, fungi, and even animals such as termites and bark beetles. A second group of diazotropes is the associative diazotropes. They live in close association with plant roots, mycorrhizae, mycorrhizal hypha, on leaf surfaces, and even on stems. They do not penetrate the cell wall, but they may occur in the cellular interspaces. And the third kind is the free-living diazotrophs. They live as independent organisms, usually on or in the soil, on plant surfaces. They can, and they include the cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. Perhaps the most important group of diazotrophs are the symbiotic nodule-forming organisms. We have Rhizobium, which is a bacteria that lives symbiotically with legumes. We also have Frankia. It's an actinomycete that lives symbiotically with 15 known genera. Plants that form nodules are known as actinorhizal. On rangelands, some of the actinorhizal genera include alder, ceanothus, mountain mahogany, cliff rose, bitterbrush, blackberry and raspberry, buffaloberry, silverberry, and also the Russian olive. As related to succession, nitrogen fixation is variable, but generally nitrogen fixation is high in early succession where we have symbiotic and free-living diazotrophs. They are more abundant. Then the fixation declines in mid-seral stages, loss of these early seral symbionts, and then again nitrogen fixation increases in later stages of succession, but do not approach the levels that occurred in early succession. And this increase is caused because lichen appears. We might have blue-green algal crusts that develop in the rangelands that you heard about in previous lessons. The high input of anthropogenic nitrogen has in some areas altered the nitrogen cycles. Increased abundance of nitrogen can potentially alter the competitive relationship of native species. So let's switch from talking about fixation of nutrients to losses of nutrients. So one cause of loss is leaching and surface runoff of nutrients. For example, the soluble nutrients include chlorine, magnesium, potassium, sodium, calcium, ammonia, and nitrate. Surface runoff may remove both soluble and non-soluble nutrients. The soil pH can alter the solubility of some nutrients, particularly cations, and thereby affect leaching potential. Soil pH can be altered by fire, which is related to the amount of ash that's produced and incorporated in the soil, but also fertilization and acid rain. Greater losses of nutrients occur in more acidic soils. Another important cause of nutrient loss is fire through fly ash, volatilization, and wind erosion of ash. Nitrogen, organic phosphorus, and sulfur can be volatilized at low to moderate fire temperatures, such as in smoldering combustion. Inorganic phosphorus, potassium, and sodium can be volatilized at higher temperatures. So the amount of nitrogen loss is directly related to the amount of fuel that is consumed. During high-intensity fires, significant amounts of nutrients can be lost in the form of fly ash. That's ash that's produced and then just flies away. And wind erosion may transport and deposit this ash. And of course, this is particularly significant on rangelands where wind is common. A third cause of loss of nutrients is soil erosion. Nutrient losses are related to the intensity of the erosion, the intensity of precipitation events related to the event, and the time it takes to stabilize the site. A fourth cause of nutrient loss is biological denitrification. Some microbes may convert nitrogen-containing organic compounds to gases, N2 or N2O. These may then be lost to the atmosphere. This process is called denitrification. So let's look at the nutrient relationships to primary succession. First, the sedimentary type nutrients. The total amount is initially high and gradually declines as weathering, leaching, and other losses occur. The available amount is initially low because the nutrients are tied up in the rock, but then increases as weathering occurs and releases these nutrients, and then declines as the parent material becomes well weathered and losses occur. For the gaseous type of nutrients, the total amount of nitrogen and carbon are initially low, but then generally increases as the soil develops because of the vegetation that sequesters carbon and brings it back into the soil. Factors that affect the weathering and nutrient cycling include the parent material itself, so the mineral that the parent material is formed of, the climate, rates generally decline in cold and arid climates, and also soil pH, which influences the soil chemical processes and soil organism abundance. Soil pH can be influenced by parent material, climate, and vegetation, and also by humans via fertilization and acid rains. Other factors include the water cycle, which influences soil microclimate, plant community, erosion potential, and leaching potential, and also fire occurrence, which influences particularly the gaseous elements of carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur, but also the organic part of phosphorus, and other minerals and nutrients as well, if the fire occurs at higher severity, which was mentioned earlier. So what about nutrient relationships to secondary succession? Well, the process of secondary successions tends to incorporate nutrients into organic materials with greater and greater length turnover rates, thus lowering the total nutrient source available. Earlier successional stages are more open in terms of nutrients, and thus greater losses can occur through leaching during that time. Some disturbances, such as fire, result in an immediate reduction in total nitrogen. The diazotrophs are often enhanced by these situations and then act to recharge the lost nitrogen from the system. However, if the disturbances occur too frequently and there's not enough time between disturbance events, the total available nitrogen can decline in the system. Diazotrophs may also be important in the later stages of succession, where you have life forms such as lichens and cyanobacteria. And finally, the disturbances such as fire and herbivory result in rapid organic matter decomposition and release of nutrients formerly incorporated into plant biomass. We'll talk more about disturbance later in this class. Just to put some numbers to this discussion about nutrients in ecosystems, this is an example of the nitrogen distribution in sagebrush steppe. As you can see from this graph, 94% of the soil is tied up in soil organic matter and another 2% in root system nitrogen. So a total of 96% of the nitrogen in this system is in the soil and is therefore to a large degree protected from disturbance such as fire. The nitrogen distribution in pinyon juniper ecosystems is a little different, with up to 18% located in the above ground biomass. These systems are therefore more susceptible to loss of nitrogen during a fire. And that concludes the lesson, and we'll talk more about soils in the next lecture.